Okay, everybody out there in YouTube land, it is I, your host of Role Player with 1,000 Faces, Matt Yancik. I am the founder and head game master at the multinational conglomerate Manufactured Myth and Legerdemain. We have offices in Dubai, London, Tokyo. I believe we're building one right now in, I believe it's Los Angeles. And we also have a big one here in my apartment with my cat tree and all that. But anyway, it's very nice to see you all here today. Thank you very much for tuning in. I do appreciate your viewership. And I've got a really nice show for us planned tonight, but it would not be me if I didn't try and tease some stuff that we have coming up. So the first order of business is that coming up on Tuesday, the 8th, I am very happy to report that I will have on the program Lil Red Dot, who is currently working as the content production manager at Cobalt Press. I guess this is a relatively recent development. I think she just started a few months ago. But of course, before then, she was doing a lot of game design, and she's of course, a storyteller and host. And I've seen her pop up and make, of course, in addition to her own work, but every once in a while I'm watching like someone's channel and she like pops up on that channel. I'm like, oh my gosh, she crosses over with everyone. So I suppose it was only inevitable before she crossed over into my little corner of YouTube. The other thing I kind of wanted to say is that I do appreciate the new subscribers that have been kind of signing up as of late. I'm not quite sure what it is. Maybe it's the fact that I'm actually kind of doing this on a weekly basis now. But we've been getting a steady little stream of new subscribers. And for all of you new and old vets that have been watching, I do appreciate it. If you're interested in kind of like joining us in any other platforms, if maybe YouTube is not completely your thing and you would maybe like to actually interact with me or some of my guests or actually some of my co-hosts and the players I have on my games. The good thing about being part of a small community is that we actually have the time to sit down and talk, whereas like those giant ones might not be able to make like those individual conversations happen. So please do check us out. We are on Discord. There's a link in the description below. We're on Facebook and we're on Twitter. So please do check us out at your chosen platform of interaction. And now, small announcement before we get started. I just want everyone to know, I texted my mother before the program began because Mom goes to sleep every night at 9 p.m. And I was like, Mom, I'm really sorry, but tonight I'll be streaming. I won't be able to say goodnight to you. And I'm going to try and surprise her by saying goodnight to her at 9 tonight. So there may be a sudden interruption in the stream as I say goodnight, but just, forewarning is being forearmed. So just so you know. But without any more of my buffoonery or silliness, because you definitely didn't come here for that, you came here because tonight on the program, I have with me Daniel Kwan. So Daniel Kwan is probably, and we'll talk about it, but he's probably best known for the Asians Represent podcast, which is both in audio and audio/video form on YouTube as well. He's been doing that for a few years now, but he's so much more than that, folks. And trust me, I know because I've been secretly lurking and digging into his background. He's also, of course, done some game design. He's done some writing. And he's one of the cool things I actually wanted to talk to him about, and I'm not going to talk about it too much right now, but is he does like little micro RPG stuff that I kind of am interested in, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And he's also got a little game about World War I going. So without further ado, let me end my silliness and let's just go talk to Daniel. Daniel, hello over there.
Hello. Thank you for having me on the show. That was quite the introduction.
No, you've done quite the amount of stuff in your life. And like I was saying, like when I first decided I wanted to interview you, I thought it would be just another typical sort of interview and it would be pretty straightforward. But the truth is, as I kind of dived in, I sort of started to discover you've got so much kind of going on in your background. And kind of speaking of that, maybe could we start at the beginning? Could we
Yeah,
go
so
back
I
and
was when I was born, it was not
it was I was
um
born at a very young age.
I was born very young. No, the yeah, background wise, oh my God. I guess the way I kind of typically introduce myself to the gaming community is obviously you already said I'm the co-host of the Asians Represent podcast. We've been doing that for just over 4 years now.
Oh.
That's been a lot of fun. I've been podcasting for longer, but
Mm.
Asians Represent is kind of, a big passion project of mine. I've been playing D&D for over 2 decades now,
Mm.
and like other tabletop RPGs. But background wise, aside from podcasting and loving tabletop role playing games, I'm a former educator and a former academic, actually. So I used to be an educator at the Royal Ontario Museum here in Toronto, and I was a former academic archaeologist. I have a master's in Japanese archaeology, and I was working on a PhD. I got to the point where I submitted my dissertation, and then I thought, you know what, I'm going to drop out of school
Mm.
and get, as what my parents would call, a real job.
Well,
Luckily, though, well, I guess not luckily. That would kind of, I would say, fortunately for me, I would say like less than a year after I had left the academic world, the pandemic happened. And so I found myself very lucky and grateful that I had made that sort of decision. But I no longer work in academia, but I like to use the skills and the knowledge that I got there and the experiences in role-playing games. So in the games industry, I work as a narrative designer, a cultural consultant, a sensitivity reader, and a game mechanics designer. And I kind of like to really leverage my background in anthropology and archaeology and the experiences that I had like working around the world.
yeah, I what's funny is I saw the archaeology. I know it's there. It kept popping up, and I just sort of thought to myself, like the sort of person that would study something like that, that would go through, the work of digging, and not literally, but maybe literally and
Literally too.
figuratively. Yeah, I would imagine both, right? Is someone that's probably very well suited to to like creation of worlds, say on paper, or just
Yeah.
from an audio standpoint or
Oh,
video.
very much so. I mean, like archaeology is just academic world building, right?
Hmm.
It's evidence-based world building, but there is still speculation, and I take the same sort of principles into my own work.
And I would say that, would it be fair to say that like I mean, in a weird way, they feel like yin and yang, right? I mean, you've got, on the one hand, you've got you start with the leftover pieces and you go backward. But then on the other hand, when you're actually sitting down to write, I imagine you're kind of starting from the ground up and you're creating the facade in a way, or
Very, very much so, right? I mean, if I'm currently working on a campaign setting that I test with my home game, but I would say that my academic background is certainly, it brings a lot of advantages, but it also kind of brings some disadvantages. Obviously, being overly analytical, being very critical of my work, and having to have like the pieces in place that I would want if I were doing this, in an academic context. But yeah, I think I definitely start from like the bottom up with my work. Like I wrote out an entire like mythical to prehistoric and historic history of the world that I'm creating, and now I'm currently working on the politics of the world, all of the big leaders and houses, all of that. The kinds of things that would inhabit this world. I haven't even written anything mechanical for it yet.
Now, is this something that we know about, or is this something that maybe hasn't been announced yet?
Oh yeah,
this...
it's out there. On my if you head to my itch.io store, it's just danielhkwan.itch.io. I've released a couple of little tidbits like Paradise Mountain and Denizens of Mountains and Seas. Those are all components of like a much larger setting that I'm working on, and kind of like I think of them as little experiments, as like, how do I want to present this to an audience, or how do I want to just hold myself accountable to work?
So let's go back to the very beginning. Were you this kind of like creative when you were younger? Was there something that inspired you? Did you take, because if you were going to school for your PhD, at a certain point, Now, to me, and this may be like just something that I think about, like PhD is like nothing to sneeze at, right? So if you're doing your PhD, you've got to set, a lot of times you set aside the things that you things that you love, things you're passionate about, because you get 100% laser focused on that PhD.
I think it's also one of the reasons why I left as well. Right. It's also one of the reasons why I left. For me, I like to think that I've always been this sort of quirky and creative, my entire life. I love to talk. And something my parents have always made sure that I never forgot. Love to talk. I really like learning. And I think that's kind of what suited me for academia, is the love of like, hey, I want to, not necessarily in a grand sense, discover new things, but I want to enrich myself, and I want to put myself in a setting where I can do so. Same thing can be said for game design. Same thing can be said for podcasting, right? When you're having a conversation with someone, you are not only enriching your audience, but you're enriching yourself. So for me, I've always been curious about learning. And so that's kind of what got me into academia. And of all things, it was actually hand in hand with tabletop role-playing games. I've told the story at a couple of other shows that I've been on, but for me, it all kind of started when I was like 10 or 11 years old. And my mom signed my brother and I up for this like summer camp at our local museum. And it was like a Dungeons and Dragons summer camp. No idea what D&D was, but it was literally at Canada's largest natural and cultural history museum, playing D&D in the galleries. And it was like the coolest thing ever. And during that camp, we went behind the scenes. We met the curators and technicians. And I met this archaeologist named Dr. Robert Mason. And you could search him up, Dr. Robert Mason, Royal Ontario Museum. He's still there. He was this like British dude, got tattoos, spoke with an accent, loved weapons. His office was just like full of arms and armor. He studied ceramics, but arms and armor were like his passion. Yeah. And I just thought he was like the coolest human being ever. And I wanted to be just like him. And so like from that moment, I was like, well, I want to work at a museum. I want to be just like Dr. Mason. And so that kind of what sent me on this sort of like journey. And so I started volunteering at the museum, working at the museum. After I got my degree, I ended up teaching at the museum. I worked at the Royal Ontario Museum for like 14 years. It was like my first job. Wow. It was my first ever job working there.
That's impressive.
And I worked there for a really long time, like part-time and full-time, depending on like contracts that I had.
Yeah.
And then I ended up ultimately teaching that Dungeons and Dragons camp and that course throughout the years and summers while I was in grad school. But it all kind of came full circle when I started my master's. Dr. Mason ended up being my mentor, my academic mentor. And he trained me on, analytical techniques that I would use for my research. So I kind of like had this like idol who grew to be my mentor, which was really cool. I actually went to visit him at the museum like maybe 2 months ago. And we sat down in his office for like 2 hours and kind of just talked. He had a very profound impact on my life and career. But when I went into academia, one thing you need to have is that laser focus. And for me, my focus was always on learning. But when you're in the academy, you're not necessarily guiding the type of learning you want to do. You're doing the research that will get you the funding. You're doing the research that's available to you, and you can't really do the things you want to learn.
Yeah.
For me, it was also a matter of like, I have all of these passions. I like to talk. I like to learn. I like to share my knowledge. And academia is a very insular community. It's not one that's designed to really share that knowledge with others. Like if you try to go find an academic journal, hidden behind a paywall, things like that. And not to say that I'm like disenchanted by the academy, but for me, I couldn't be that laser focused. Yeah. I wanted to do more. I wanted to do different things. And I certainly gained a lot from the experiences that I had, getting my master's, doing 6 years of a PhD and traveling the world. But I couldn't be like my colleague. I shared an office with this guy, and he was like laser focused. He was constantly on it. He loved talking about the work that he was doing. And for me, I was like, that's not me. And it kind of hit a point where I was like, for my own health and well-being and for the future that I want, I don't think I can be here anymore.
So let me ask you this then. So,
Mm-hmm.
and again, maybe this is just my impression, because when you look at somebody and you get a sort of image of a person from looking at them online, it's often it can be very different in real life. Are you
Of course,
telling me
yeah.
then, are you more of a jack of all trades that is kind of like you are too interested in too many different things to sort of sit still
In an
in one?
academic setting, 100%. 100%. I am technically still the subject matter expert on what I did my research on,
Mm-hmm.
which can be interpreted as sad,
Mm-hmm.
given the entire state of the academy, but also like the specificity of the research that I did. Um, but for me, yeah, I had all these other interests. There were all these other things that I wanted to do. And if you want to succeed in the academy, you can't have those things. You need to be hyper focused, but you also need to make certain sacrifices, like looking for jobs outside of your given city, or be willing to take sort of like really low paying contracts until you maybe get that tenure position, especially in the social sciences, right? So for me, it was a realization that this wasn't for me. And basically taking the step to say, you know what? This isn't a matter of pride anymore. This is a matter of I need to do what's best for me, and this is not it.
So let me ask you then to sort of go in a slightly different direction, but still something that runs kind of parallel. The role playing, if you've been doing the role playing for like 20 something years, then
Yeah.
and that's sort of where you seem to have ended up now. It could be an accident, but it could also be the fact that your passion has taken you in this direction. What is it about the role playing that you enjoyed enough to have continued for actually now, I guess if you were working at the museum, you said for 14 years?
14 years, yeah.
14 years. You've been role playing for 20 years, right? So
Yeah, more than that now, actually, like I think 22. I just I had my birthday was like last Friday.
oh my goodness, I forgot to get you
Yeah.
something.
Oh, so that's okay. You know what? You gave me a platform.
Okay, right. Yes. So I should have done this on your birthday. Happy birthday, Daniel. Everybody
No,
jumps
that's
up.
okay. But yeah, that was for me, it was very much like, hey, you know what? Time to do something different.
What was it then
Yeah,
about? What was the what
about
was it
role playing
about
games.
RPGs that drew you back
Yeah,
to that
I
work?
mean, for me, it was kind of by accident. So I didn't really realize that it could be like a thing I do.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have a day job. I work in tech during my 9 to 5 is in tech. Uh, and I really love my day job, but I also like work in RPGs and have the luxury of only working on projects that I think are interesting or that I think kind of push sort of my sort of goals for the industry forward, like better Asian representation and things like that. It's a luxury that I honestly have, and I like it that way because it doesn't become my day job and it can stay my passion. Um, so for me, like what intrigued me about RPGs and what kind of held me in was that like one end it was the thing that helped me realize what I was passionate about. It's a vector for learning,
Mm.
right? Learning is more than just, reading books and regurgitating knowledge. It's application. It's, deep understanding. It's the ability to, teach others. And for me, with role-playing games, it was very much an opportunity for me to show teenagers that you can develop a passion for learning, for science, for history, and you can engage those passions through play. And I think playing at a table or sitting on the floor in the gallery of a museum is a really great informal learning environment. And, like I see a lot of the kids that I taught, and some of them they're like lawyers now or
Mm.
photographers or like they work in theater, and it's really cool to see. And all of that kind of comes from a game. I think over my career teaching, I've taught over 1,000 kids
Yeah.
how to play D&D. And I'm super proud of that. because that means I helped 1,000 kids
Mm-hmm.
kind of discover their own passion, whether or not it be gaming or not. I gave them a place and a space to do that sort of exploration. And that's why I think role-playing games are so important. I think it's also, in general, a really great informal tool for, developing your critical thinking skills. You're an educator, right?
Mm-hmm.
Developing your critical thinking skills, working on your self-confidence, your ability to react to situations, your ability to share space with people in a conversation, the ability for you to manage your time, work on your math skills, your writing. These are all real skills that are honed in a game.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
What
the
did
and
you
yeah,
hone in a game? So when your mentor was kind of
yeah,
like, what was it that you were honing? What do you think? What was different about Daniel when he came out of that process? Was there
of
something
that
that,
process,
yeah,
I think very much seeing the value in like everything around me. Right, walking outside and being like, "Oh, this would be really cool," and being able to see inspiration in something, and not to say that in like an egotistical way, like everything gives me inspiration and I'm an
mm,
artist. No, it's not that. It's looking at something and saying, "Hey, this is maybe a mundane object, but this is also something that you could do something really interesting with." Um, or like, "Hey, I want to hear your story," and games are a vector for understanding and sharing stories.
yeah,
And so for me, I think the biggest thing that was different about me or made me different in playing games was that I realized that like stories are really important. I
mm,
realized that stories are a way of teaching, stories are a way of perpetuating cultural and behavioral norms. Whether or not you're pretending to be in a fantasy world, there are still unwritten rules at a table,
mm,
right? It's the same thing with sort of historical knowledge when families pass down their stories, their behaviors, their expectations of how people act. It's the same thing with saying, "Hey, we're a party of adventurers and we're going into town. How do we conduct ourselves?" Or, "Hey, you're at a store and the merchant is trying to give you a bad deal, or you're trying to get a deal. How do we navigate these social situations? How do we explore our identities?" That can all be done through storytelling. And so for me, I think the awakening, the realization was that like, hey, stories are more than just for entertainment. They are for like growth
mm.
and sort of self-reflection, but also, sharing who you are in a safe way.
I think what's interesting about what you say, first of all, just to rewind a little bit to the thing that you mentioned about details and how
Yeah.
even the most mundane details can be special. I think this is an important connection to make because as we grow older, and I know you're Canadian, I'm an
Yes.
American, but like, and I'm sure that we have slight cultural differences in that respect. But like in America, the kind of emphasis is in the United States, the emphasis is kind of like on shrugging off your childish sort of ways of thinking and becoming an adult, and you don't
Same
play.
thing. Same thing here. I think play is looked down upon, and
Yeah.
even like culturally, like I'm Chinese. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why aren't you a doctor? Why aren't you an engineer? Why aren't you a lawyer? Those are very much realities that I have to deal with, and expectations that I either have to sort of like that I need to internalize
Right.
and let control me, or acknowledge and kind of, you know, pave my own path while also respecting my parents and taking care of my parents.
Right.
Right. Another thing for me was like, if I really want to pursue academia, I have to be willing to move anywhere to get a job.
Mm.
And for me, as my parents age, I don't want to move
Right.
anywhere else. I want to stay where I am in Toronto so I can take care of my parents when that time comes.
I think.
And
Oh, go ahead.
yeah. So no, so those are all those. I think that's the answer to the question that you had.
Yeah. No. It is absolutely it is. And I was going to say I think the idea that like I every once in a while I think back to when I was a kid and I think
Mm,
back to the amazing feeling that I had in my brain from doing something as simple as laying in the grass, looking at like an insect crawl
that
across a leaf.
wonder, that wonder that you have.
And right, and I feel like that has been stomped out of like a lot of people in the like a lot of
Yeah.
people in general, a lot of adults, and they've forgotten that wonder. And I feel like the games themselves, kind of like what you were saying, are
kind of
are
awaken that.
yeah, they awaken that. And I was going to say and ask you, it sounds like being a game master, running a game, is a real responsibility. Do you view your job when you're game mastering either on a stream, podcast, or
Or my
maybe
home
even in
game or
private?
whatever.
Do you see game mastering as like a responsibility to the people that you are with?
I think so. Not in like a very grand sense or anything like that, but I think that running the game is very much like, I like to use the term dramatic manager, right? It's like you're here to help other people tell stories, and they're here to also help you tell your story. And together you collaboratively tell something that is unique to this particular instance, right? It's not one person's story, it's collectively everyone's story. And everybody brings their own experiences and goals into that.
Mm.
I really love running games, whether it be in like my home game, we're on like, or like we've been playing for like my current game. I think we're like 35 sessions deep now.
Mm-hmm.
It's currently the longest game I've got. The longest game I had was like 5 years. But this one is like very meaningful to me because, you know, I have everybody kind of brings in their own sorts of stories, but I also have set it in my world, so I get to share my culture with my players.
Mm. What
Yeah.
what do you think then? What do you think then are some of the qualities? Like if you want to set aside, what do you think makes a really good game master then? Or
Oh, honestly, it really
dramatic
depends on.
manager? What do you think?
I think it really depends on like the table as well, right? Some people want like a tactical experience. Some people just want fighting. Some people want no fighting and they want narrative. I think what makes a good game master, dungeon master, dramatic manager, facilitator, master of ceremonies, I think so long as the expectations of the game master align with the expectations of the players and vice versa, I think you're going to get something good. But ultimately, the universal skills of a game master are those of, you know, a good human being, right? The ability to be an active listener, the ability to relinquish spotlight, the ability to allow other people to have a say in a conversation. I think are the qualities of a good game master, regardless of the type of gameplay experience you want. If you want a tactical experience, how are you going to make sure that everybody gets to look cool? If you want a narrative experience, how do you ensure that everybody gets spotlight and everybody gets to have that wow moment? It's all about balancing expectations and understanding when it's your turn to talk, when it's your turn to relinquish that spotlight, but also how to communicate and set that example to your players. Because I think another skill that being a player, I think being a player has the exact same skills too, right? It's like, when is it my turn to try to do something cool? Or when is it my turn to try to, you know, do my thing? When can I identify that it's my moment? And that's another thing that I think really makes RPGs a really great learning tool. I actually, like last year, I put out this tweet. It was a super innocent tweet. I was on like a Wizards of the Coast stream and with a couple of really awesome people, all who talking about running D&D for kids. And I made a comment during the stream that I don't track hit points. It was like a one-off thing because I don't track hit points because I like to make sure that the fight kind of goes in a direction that, again, kind of helps people meet those narrative needs. Do I have a character who's like, this is their boss? I don't want somebody else landing the final blow.
Right.
I want everybody to feel like they're contributing.
Right.
And especially when you're running this for kids.
Yeah.
And somebody had mentioned that and tweeted at me, and I retweeted it and said, yeah, you know, I don't track HP. And it just kind of blew up the internet.
Yeah, I can
imagine. And I got people sending me hate mail being like, you're ruining D&D. And all of that.
That would be an accomplishment. Now that would be something to put on
that would be.
I
and
ruined
so
D&D forever.
I know, right? And I mean, people are like, look what happened. Look what you did to Oriental Adventurers. Look what you did to HP. But for me, it's like, I think not tracking HP is really a good example of my idea of what a good game master must have. And it's, you know, letting people have their moment.
Yeah. I think that's great. I mean, that really shows like real thought. And to me, that strikes me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like you're a very, and I would assume maybe because you use Powered by the Apocalypse, but you're more of a narrative based like
You know
environment
what? I'm
games
actually
or,
not. I love
oh,
Crunch. I love Crunch. Like
interesting.
my
Okay.
favorite edition of D&D is 3.5/3. I
Mm-hmm.
love Pathfinder first edition.
Hmm.
I really like Crunch. Long history of like wargaming.
Mm-hmm.
I love Crunch. I love mechanics. I like systems. Powered by the like I think narrative is important. I think it's the perfect game lets you balance both.
Hmm.
But there was
Ah,
a reason why we used Powered by the Apocalypse for Ross rifles, which I imagine
yeah.
you're alluding to.
Yeah.
It's because we actually wrote Ross rifles for kids.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Because, yeah, because
we wrote Ross rifles with the intention of putting it in classrooms.
that's what I had. I didn't know that specifically, but I did know because I'd seen a few interviews with you where you talked about how you were developing it as an educational game. And
Yeah.
I just thought that kind of blew my mind because I thought this is great. I'm always glad to see another person, another team, another group working on a game that's designed to go into classrooms or at least to touch children in a way and like affect them in a positive way and help them learn, help them grow. So that doesn't okay, now that
The
kind of
origin of the
clicks.
game was actually in the fact that so when I was teaching at the Royal Military Museum,
Mhm.
November 11th, Remembrance Day was coming up,
Mhm.
and I wanted to do like a really immersive sort of lesson. And I was like, you know what, we'll go and we'll tour. The University of Toronto has a lot of First World War monuments and stuff, so we'll go see those. I'll prepare a lesson and we'll do it outside. But then I didn't want us to come back and play D&D. I wanted us to play a World War One game for like just this day. And I did some searching, and most of the World War One games I found really lean towards the sort of weird, like, oh, the horrors of
Yeah.
No Man's Land are all like spirits and werewolves and vampires and stuff like that. And that just wasn't it for me. Another thing that's really important to me is kind of representation. And this kind of comes from both like an academic perspective, but also just like who I am as a person. I had met this gentleman named Jack Chin. Jack was like a retired engineer. He like lives out of a van, travels the world golfing and stuff. He's a cool dude. But he had been working with a local Chinese Canadian museum in Vancouver, and he had actually uncovered the story of this soldier named Frederick Lee. Now, when I say Frederick Lee, a World War One soldier, most folks would lean into, oh, it's a British dude, a white dude. Lee, really common, right? Like the Lee Enfield rifle and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But Frederick Lee was actually a Chinese man. And through a lot of research, Jack and a lot of these other scholars discovered that Frederick was actually one of the first known Chinese Canadians to fight and die in combat.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And his grave, a lot of people didn't realize that his grave was the grave of a Chinese person. And I thought that this was such a cool story because I didn't know that people like me fought in the First World War. Because when you look at, your history textbooks,
Yeah.
you only see white people.
Yeah.
Same thing with the United States. If you look up Operation Oblivion during World War II, this was a unit of highly trained Chinese people who went to fight in the Pacific because they looked like the Japanese.
Right.
But people don't know about that. And so for me, it was like, I really want to tell a story that can show that people like me and other sort of marginalized folks at the time, including people who folks might consider white, had these unique experiences and stories. And so my co-authors like Patrick and Daniel, who actually worked for me at the museum, were good friends. We were like, you know what? Why don't we just make our own game? And so we wrote Ross rifles with the intent of being like, hey, we'll use it as a one-off just to teach kids World War One. And what we did was we actually ran like the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and each table and all of my staff were running different parts of the battle. And we were kind of tracking it. And we were like, you know what, we should just make this a game. And we just kind of pursued it. We went to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario, the capital of Canada. And we spent like an entire weekend in their armory, just learning about the Ross rifle and its history and trying to make sure we equipped people with the tools to, tell an engaging and dangerous story, but also to like learn about the war. And that's why Ross Rifles is like 33% history textbook.
But I think that's I think that's actually, from my own perspective, I mean, I feel that it's very inspiring to a youngster, or to me even as an adult, when I see I'm very much into like a lot of research and like accuracy in my games, and sort of and to me, I think, and to a lot of children, that would actually be something that's very inspiring. You get to read through it in order to play it out, or in order to kind of understand and break it down,
Yeah.
maybe step by step. And I think you had mentioned in that same interview that the game was also really about the stories of a lot of the people
The people,
involved.
yeah, because like you're not meant to change the outcome of the First World
Right.
War, right? The war was fought on a scale that an individual or a small group of people wouldn't really have a profound impact on the global politics surrounding the First World War. So it's very much about like the stories you tell in your trench, the impact that you have on those around you, very much like you would have in society. You look at, and it just happens to be on Netflix now, All Quiet on the Western Front, or the movie 1917, all about small scale impact or companionship. And that's kind of what we wanted to tell. And so, yes, there is like the goal of being historically accurate, but also the freedom of the result of your actions not having to impact these wider things, and having that sort of idea of, oh, well, we can't win this fight because, Canada doesn't win this battle.
Right.
You can win the engagement. Right. And so you're not holding yourself back that way. And then you can kind of focus on, well, who am I as a person? What would I be carrying? Those sorts of things are what we wanted people to think about.
When we're talking then again about the responsibilities of the game master and the amount of accuracy maybe involved historically, but and all of that, do you have a particular way that you prepare for your games or manage your tables? Or because like you said, like, you're not going to win the war in one game, say, or it could be World War I, it could be a fantasy game, it could be a science fiction game.
I ran Ross Rifles. The last Ross Rifles game I played was set during the Clone Wars.
I was going to say, yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
I was like, what the? I got to watch
It's the same. It's the same themes.
Right.
They're all there, right?
Yes. How do you prepare for that, for your games and for what you run, whether it be a private game or?
Yeah, it's the same thing for any game that I run. I think that the first thing you have to really acknowledge is that you never want to gatekeep like the truth, right? Because history is very subjective, and they say like, oh, the winners write history and the losers don't get to write it. But also, even the winners will exclude things from their side of the story. So for me, it's, I'm never preparing. So if it's for a Ross Rifles game, it'll be like, okay, well, I want to do this battle. This is what the environment would be like. This is the weather. But everything else will kind of work around that. One of my favorite games of Ross Rifles was actually played on a podcast. Podcast is called Party of One. It's a podcast by Jeff Stormer, who basically does 1-to-1 RPGs. And I forget which battle it was, but the entire thing was Jeff's character was a Canadian soldier who found himself trapped in the middle of no man's land during a battle with a young German soldier. And it was just to my knowledge, this never happened, but it was like, hey, we could talk about what the German soldier is wearing and what's going on in a wider context. What are their sort of motivations? But what's happening in this very moment is purely fiction. Same thing for my like campaign setting in my home game. One thing that I always kind of like to encourage people to do is, if you are trying to use history to, particularly like ancient history, I don't say this about contemporary history or, within the past like 100 years, but if you're trying to tell say, I'm going to use, really common when you see it, it's like, oh, I'm going to make a game about feudal Japan. or I want to make a game with samurai. Okay, well, what time period is this going to be? And people tend to just blend everything. For me, with my campaign, it's actually based on a very, very specific time period in China's history, like the Warring States period and the Spring and Autumn periods, a time when there was a lot of political strife, but also a time when not everything was very well documented. So there is a lot of room for ambiguity and interpretation. There's some play. And so for me, I never try to blend time periods or cultures. And so that is the one thing that I always recommend people. It's like, hey, if you're going to try to make something about ancient China, what time period do you want to be inspired by? And use that as your foundation and try not to take from other time periods. Sometimes that makes research difficult. Sometimes it makes things really easy to do. Like, hey, I want to do the Three Kingdoms period in China. There's so well documented. There's a lot of fiction and a lot of academic and publicly available like information out there for folks. I mean, there's an entire video game series called Dynasty Warriors about it.
I was gonna say.
But like that would be a really interesting one to play an RPG in, right? There is a Three Kingdoms RPG, but I don't think it's very good. But in general, my tip is always, if you're trying to use history as kind of a foundation for your game, you can be loose with history, but don't be loose with your inspiration. So if you're going to say, hey, I want to do this aspect of this culture, well, kind of narrow in on this time period so that you aren't blending things in a disrespectful way. It's honestly one of the easiest ways not to be disrespectful.
Is this so you mentioned the game that you're playing now?
Yeah.
The campaign you're running now, is that the 35?
Running and playing are the same thing.
Right. Is it?
Yeah.
Is it? Can I ask a little bit about like the story wise? Like,
sure. Yeah, I'm happy to tell you all about it.
I'd love to hear what you're doing.
It's interesting. So like,
and what system maybe you're using. I'm kind of
5th edition D&D.
Okay.
5th edition D&D with a lot of homebrew rules. So for context, there's 4 players and me. Half of the players are very proficient in 5th edition D&D. One of them had never played before, and one has experience in other RPGs. It's a really interesting makeup of folks. So one of the players, Mark Richardson, on Twitter's Slave to the Hat. Mark is actually an ENnie Award-winning cartographer. Mark did the maps for 7th Sea.
Oh, that's why I've heard the name. Okay, all right.
Yeah. So Mark's like one of my closest friends. So yeah, Mark's in the group. Drew and Emma are both from Asians Represent, both in the group. Emma and I actually have been friends for like over a decade because we met each other in grad school. We both have the same academic supervisor. We both like traveled Asia together. And then my other friend player her name is Kendra, and she's a photographer. And we actually met while I was doing one of my many jobs at the museum. And so we have this really interesting makeup of people. Half of the group is Asian, half are white. And the story kind of started in, I actually used the Ghost of Saltmarsh book. I used the starter adventure in Ghost of Saltmarsh as kind of like, hey, this is a primer to D&D. I want to do something familiar, with the intent of then inserting my own story and then taking the players across the sea into my land. The overall story is essentially I place like a early plot device in Saltmarsh where Mark's character was a tabaxi warlock who had made a pact with a djinn. And my long-term plan was that this djinn is actually not a djinn, but rather the avatar of a fire god that has been banished and has been manipulating them into collecting these objects. And these objects are these rings. There's this cult, and they're trying to collect all the rings to form almost like an instrument that can signal the location of this hidden prison for this fire avatar. And so he was being kind of manipulated into finding these objects. And the party's kind of brought into it when one of the other players, who's kind of looking for her brother, sees her brother has been indoctrinated by this sort of cult while traveling overseas to learn about the world. And our sort of Saltmarsh sort of arc ended with that player killing her brother and now bearing this grudge. The meta plot involves a cult called the Sapphire Flame trying to free a character, the antagonist called the Eternal Flame Emperor, who's the avatar of this ancient fire god, from a prison to basically cleanse the land once more. A pretty classic plot. But this all kind of goes back to sort of the history of my world. Right now, the players are kind of on the run from this cult, but also trying to discover the motivations of the cult and themselves kind of kill this flame emperor once and for all. And so they're kind of involved in like the politics of the land. They encountered a greedy prince who is secretly minting his own currency, and might be aligned with the cult for his own political gain, where he wants to usurp his father and has made all these grand political connections. We have players who are, one of my players, Drew, his character's wife he basically wrote in his backstory, his wife is missing and he's looking for her. And I said, cool. She messed up and is actually now working as the personal sort of assassin for the king of my land, because she's a white foreigner and there's plausible deniability in what she's doing for him. And so he's now his character has this grudge, and it's like, well, I want to, work to save this land, but I also understand that the political leaders, the sort of status quo of this land has sort of ruined my life. So I have all these like meta plots going on, and I have them in a database that I track.
I was going to say, I love, I often tell my players that like their backstories will be like mercilessly woven into the adventure.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of like taking those little elements, and of course I assume that maybe your players are kind of
smashing them together.
Yes, and smashing them together and bringing them back to.
We're at a point right now where every single character has now very firmly connected. One player, his character died. Mark's character actually died. Totally unplanned. He sacrificed himself to save the group from, I had been building up this sort of antagonist that would be hunting them. And Mark was like, no, I'm going to end it right now. And sacrificed his character.
How did the players, there have been a few times where
there were tears.
I was going to say
that moment.
It's hard, isn't it? It can be.
Yeah. We had this whole thing where he basically, when he realized that his warlock patron was actually manipulating him, where he tried to basically tear the patron out of him. And he eventually carried this like flaming scar on his hand for a really long time. And this scar was actually drawing danger to the group. And I had actually designed a creature that was meant to be unkillable. And it would just slow, every time they fought it, they would be able to neutralize it, and it would come back stronger, and it would bring back elements of how they defeated it to the next fight. And he said, no, I'm going to kill this. This thing is attracted to this power that I'm trying to get rid of. And there ended up being this moment where they had turned this entire beautiful lake into holy water, enchanted divine water. And they tossed this sort of armored disciple of this flame emperor into it. And there was this really dramatic moment where there was this violent reaction, and all of the water in the lake ended up being evaporated in an instant.
I love it.
Revealing basically an ancient city at the bottom of the lake, an ancient holy city, because this town is actually a scholar town. And in that moment, I was describing this thing broken and slowly reforming at the bottom of this now dried out lake, hinting that like time to run. And all the characters were really wounded. And Mark was like, what do I see at the bottom of the lake? And I'm like, well, you see ancient relics, blades, stuff like that. And he's like, okay. He steps into the lake, takes an ancient sword, because he's like, this is holy, right? This is imbued with divine energy because it's at the bottom of this holy lake. And I was like, yeah. So he's like, I put my hand on this reforming monstrosity and I stab the blade through my hand, and I want to purge myself of this energy. And I was like, okay, well, how do you want to die? Because he was telling me, he messaged me on Discord, because we all live in different places. He messaged me on Discord. He's like, I want to sacrifice my character right now. And so I said, well, how do you go? and there was this, like, we basically, the way we did it was there was this big explosion and it left this basically perfect crater in the bottom of the lake. His character had this vision that we sort of role played out of him seeing his parents and family before he left for his big journey, and the rest of the party had to flee the scene. So he sacrificed his character, and we introduced a new character for him in a really sort of like organic way. And now his new character has taken on, is slowly taking on the form of another god called the Lord of Rain, who was killed by the ancient fire god that the Flame Emperor is an avatar of. And so all the players, he is now fully integrated into the group, and all the players are assembling basically the tools that they would need to essentially, in a cyclical way, redo an ancient battle that the gods had in my setting.
What wonderful imagery. I love the idea when you said it, and I'm glad you did it. But the first thing I thought was this lake has got to flash evaporate. And if that's not a wonderful image of seeing something at the like, that's wonderful. You know what's really interesting to me as you say it, and it's interesting to me the way that you're hitting these major beats. The memories that you and your players are making are pretty much being burned into your head the same way.
Our last session was awesome. I'm still riding the high of our last session. So much so that I haven't even planned the next one.
Let me ask you this.
It's in a couple days.
Let me ask you this. When you ride that high, I'm not able to sleep. Like if I have a really good session after running it, I'm like, yeah. I wish
I'm already like, I'm very much the type of DM where I like to message my players in advance and be like, okay, so I have this idea. Yeah. I'm like, no, I don't want to, like, do you want to hear my spoilery idea? Like, right. I'd like to involve people. I don't want everything to be a surprise. Like, obviously things will be new and they won't see it coming. But if there's a big fork in the road that I might present to a player, I want to ask them first to make sure it's okay. And we had essentially one of the characters, Drew's character, he's like a monk and he's a Dampier, and he's the one whose wife is kind of being forced to be an assassin for the king. And his wife became a sort of like this political prisoner when she was looking for a cure for his vampirism. And I asked him, like, do you have an idea of what you want the cure to be? Because I want you to make a choice. Yeah. And he's like, not really. And so I said, well, what if your cure is you have to feed on pure divine energy? With the idea of basically making sure your character sticks around until the final battle, where you feed on the Flame Emperor and you take on this thing and you purge yourself of, your curse. And he said, that would be awesome. He's like, and I said, cool. I know that you want it. I'm not going to tell you when it's going to happen. Right. But in our last session, I pretended to give him the chance. And it started to take over his body, and then the entire party said no way. And they essentially robbed his character of a potential chance. Yeah. And we talked about this all in the moment and as it was happening. And Mark's character, who has this sword called the Decree of Rain, and it's actually made from the tooth of the ancient dead Lord of Rain, dragon god. And he basically, I told him, I said, every time you use it, you're going to get all these awesome powers. But I've been saying it, it's turning his character is a dwarf, so turn your skin into scales. And he basically pushed himself so much to not let Drew's character take on that curse, take on that power, that there was this moment where they got shot out of this massive they were in this like hotel that was actually carved out of this giant tree. And there was this explosion, and basically all of this fire that was being generated by Drew taking on this power was in an instant turned into steam. And there was this fog and mist. And I had this moment when a couple of the characters were literally falling out of the tree unconscious from this big battle. They ended up getting saved, but as the mist sort of settled, they saw that their dwarf character has turned into a dragonborn. And this was out of a conversation where Mark was like, hey, I don't think I want to be a dwarf anymore because I don't think it really fits in your setting. And I said, well, I've got something for you. Don't worry. And He didn't know when it was going to happen, but I had gotten his input on a long-term sort of decision.
Mm. When I can see such passion behind these games that you're
Oh,
playing.
thank you.
When did you decide, though, to sort of, what prompted you maybe to cross over from, because it's one thing maybe to have the passion for playing the game, and of course by watching your channel I know you have a passion for creating your video essays and your interviews and your discussions and some of the actual plays and all of that stuff. I know that you have a passion for that, but what was it that prompted you to sort of cross over from being just a hobbyist
Content creator?
Yeah, I don't like that word because I don't think that any of us are really, like, there are some people that are creating content. They're just trying to fill a hole. But then there are some people that are creating cool stuff and, like, textures.
Yeah, the answer is really straightforward. Like, for me, you never want, at least for me, and I wouldn't say this for everyone, but I don't want building worlds and doing that sort of work to just feel like work. I want it to still have that passion. And honestly, for me, I could take care of my family and stuff. Like, I'm a family guy. Pandemic started really wearing on me and I wanted something different. And so I ended up saying, you know what, I really want to start a home game again. I wanted to kind of run my own game, but I also use it as like a sort of semi, I guess not so much of a secret now. This is the most I've ever talked about my campaign publicly.
Thank you for expressing.
I wanted to use it as a way of play testing material that I'd want to use in Asians Represent. But then it kind of just turned into this long form thing that I've really loved. And, I don't think I would ever try to monetize like the story that my group is telling, because that's for us.
Yeah.
I will certainly, eventually publish the world and stuff like that. But the story is purely for fun, purely for us, because I think, like you and I talked about earlier, one of the important things about games is that they kind of help us maintain that sense of like childlike wonder and that feeling that, hey, you know what? It's okay to just have fun with your friends. And I think that's really important. And for me, I wouldn't say it's slowed my output, because there are other factors in my life that have slowed my like public facing creative output. But for me, it's really helped me reinforce my love of tabletop role playing games. It's helped me kind of being like, oh, I got these cool ideas, I want to test it with my group. It's got me thinking like, about the way that I approach this work and the kind of games that I seek in the first place. The types of like stories that I want to tell or be a part of. So that's kind of what kind of caused me to do a very private game.
Right. What then prompted you to go public with streaming then? So were you worried that
you mean like making content about my world?
About the world, or about just role playing in general? Because like I'm thinking about what like Harlan Ellison once sort of said, and he said, if you want to be a writer, make sure you don't get a job where you're writing all day. A day job.
Yeah.
Because you should get a job where you use your hands, because if you come home and you're sick of writing, then you're not going to write the stuff
you're not going to do it.
But
yeah, absolutely.
Here's the thing, is you've crossed over and you're still obviously passionate about your home game. It is part of this thing that, this project, I assume that at some point maybe you're going to be releasing or
I've released bits of it already,
right.
But yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah,
what prompted you to cross over into streaming and creating stuff like
the origins of Asians Represent in general?
Yeah. And you chose Asians Represent as your title, so that tells me that you're coming from a certain angle. And
yeah, absolutely.
There must have been, you're a thoughtful guy, so there must have been a lot of thought that went into this. And I'm just wondering what were some of the things that you considered?
Yeah, so I had experimented with podcasting before, and I enjoy listening to podcasts when I have the time. I like going out for a drive and listening to a podcast. I think it's cool. I like learning. for me, like starting Asians Represent was actually purely by accident. So I'm pretty involved in like the Toronto tabletop role playing game scene. And there's a con here, and it's like the big Toronto indie con. It's called Breakout Con. It's really cool. I really like it. I go every year, and I met my co-host Agatha there because I had bought Agatha lunch because I was like, hey, like I was a guest at the con. I'm gonna go grab lunch. Anybody want something? Agatha was like, yeah, can you get me shawarma? And so that's how we basically met. Um, After the con, Agatha had sent me a message on Facebook, basically being like, hey, I'm interested in doing a podcast about Asian creators. And this person at the con recommended reaching out to me to kind of learn about podcasting. I was like, oh, that's cool. And want to meet up and talk. And we ended up meeting up at this bubble tea place and basically saying like, well, why don't we do this together? I've got this experience podcasting. And I like to talk, and you have a different perspective from me. And so I reached out to James D'Amato of the One Shot Network because we were friends on Facebook. And I was like, hey, I've got this idea for a show. And it's going to be 2 Asian hosts. We're going to talk about Asian issues in the industry and interview Asian creators, but the audience is going to be everyone. And James said, yes, let's do it. And then that's kind of how Asians Represent started. And so for us, we ended up doing like once a month. We would just interview people and kind of an amateur hour sort of stuff. And then we got to a point where we were like, hey, let's try an actual play. We did like a 4-episode superhero actual play using masks because Agatha really wanted to use masks. And then we kind of slowly did our content that way. And then the pandemic hit. And in our minds, one of the things that we had been planning on doing but never did was actually streaming. Because in terms of representation, it's important to have your voice out there, but it's also important to be seen. And we weren't showing ourselves. People were hearing our voices, hearing my radio voice, I guess. And so we were like, you know what? Let's start a Twitch channel. Let's just stream. Let's just try to do the podcast live. And as a way of, because we couldn't meet in person, sit around my dining room table like we were before the pandemic. And so I said, okay, here's what we should do. Let's just read Oriental Adventures live and critique it. And it just ended up being this whole thing. You just threw it out
as a random.
We just threw it out. I was like, this would be a joke. Let's just do this. And then it just kind of turned into a thing. And like all of a sudden we're on the Huffington Post and, like these disclaimers are going on these products and I'm getting hate emails and people are really, also like really grateful that we're doing this and starting these conversations. And then we just haven't really turned back since. For us, the project of Asians Represent has always been about having conversations about the issues we face in the industry, telling our stories, and sharing our experiences with others. Because I often find that, if we're talking about our experiences with others, people will kind of see that there is more nuance to a Chinese character than Kung Fu. Yeah. There is more nuance to a Japanese world than just samurais and ninjas.
Yeah.
There are these diverse cultures in Southeast Asia that each have their own stories, material culture, and things that make them very unique. There are entire communities that, in other countries that we would never learn. Do you know what the most popular tabletop role-playing game is in Japan? I don't know if you watched the latest episode. So
well, all I know.
Or what is if you say tabletop role-playing game in North America, it's synonymous with D&D, right? What is synonymous with tabletop role-playing games in Japan?
I am embarrassed to say, because I lived there for about 7 years.
Okay.
The one time, I'll tell you
and
something.
It's not and it's not Sword World. That's their like local one.
Well, yeah. So all I can say is this: I don't really know. But I'll tell you this, the only times I've seen role-playing games in Japan were once when I went to a restaurant I used to go to regularly called Royal Host. I sat down and I saw the equivalent of me in high school, except times 4 or 5, and Japanese sitting at a table talk with Japanese monster Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
books. And when I go to the hobby shops where I went in Japan, I saw mostly D&D. But I don't know what the most popular game is.
It's Call of Cthulhu.
Is it? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I can see that.
It's Call of Cthulhu. In China, it's Fate.
Fate,
Yeah, I know that one. The
open...
Fate, like Fate, like the integer dice, like
oh wow,
Fate. I didn't know that. But yeah, in Japan, it's Call of Cthulhu. Not because of like a love for Lovecraft, but because of this idea of, we can actually cover that on the latest episode of the podcast. Because of like the flexibility in the stories you can tell. It's not rooted in European fantasy, but also because of the emphasis on characters. Likewise, there is also like the idea of cosmic, like the cosmic is very much a thing in Japanese culture and contemporary Japanese culture. But yeah, we don't get to talk about these things in a long form. So that's why, we kind of kept the podcast going. And that's the kind of direction our content has taken us to this point. It's like, let's talk about big issues. The past 2 seasons of the podcast, we've kind of focused on, talking about unity with between the Black and Asian communities.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stuff going on in North America. Next season, we're taking a new strategy and trying to sort of decenter our content from North America and take a more global approach. We actually, before we started this recording, just had a meeting with like the team, and we doubled in size because we're like, hey, we want to bring on other voices. We want to talk about different things. And we want to, once again, kind of change the direction of our content in one that is kind of meeting our goals. And as long as we continue to kind of go the road of like, hey, we want to talk about stories, we want to talk about representation, and we want to make sure that people understand that, we are not all the same.
Well, that is actually something I noticed about your show, and it's really interesting to me. And one of the questions, ladies and gentlemen, I send the questions ahead of time because I don't want people to feel like they're.
You said a lot of questions.
I said too many questions.
You said like 8 hours worth of questions.
I know, right? So one of the things I was going to ask you is how the show has evolved, but that was kind of a loaded question because the truth is I kind of feel like I already know. I was just interested in hearing what you were going to say about that, because it was very sort of focused on kind of like one thing. And yeah, you're right. I guess if I go all the way back to the beginning, and I'm not sure if you deleted anything.
It was just whatever, we've only deleted one episode.
Okay. So it looked like it was very focused on, obviously, like reading through stuff. It was focused on Asia. It was and the different like cultures and whatnot within, of course. But what I've seen is in the last recently, as you climb up the YouTube like listing of videos, there's a really nice. You can start to see that there's a mixture of topics that seem like they're growing off the same tree, and yet they're different branches of that. And there's a really healthy, to me, and interesting variety of topics that you cover.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because Wednesday is Wednesday. Today is Wednesday. Apparently very late. Friday, we have our a big episode that's like kind of very different from what we normally do. And it's it's going to be the first of a recurring sort of episode that I want to have each season. Basically about stories our parents tell us. The idea of generational knowledge and the universal experience of storytelling and the importance of stories as they relate to who we are as human beings, but also how we then take those stories into our work in the industry. And so I actually have a whole a Ziploc bag full of old family photos that I found at my parents' place. And some of them are very old. Some of them I have one here. It's very small. This is it's an old lithograph of my maternal grandfather. It's printed on was it silver, the way they used to do the
silver retention,
my camera, I think. Yeah, and that's what this one is. And it's learning about the story of my mom's side of the family. I have this photo, and it was laminated by my grandpa But it's like a very innocuous like photo. It's like four Chinese guys standing over like a mound of dirt. Um, One of the things that I learned in doing research for this episode, as my camera refocuses, is that I learned that my grandpa, my maternal grandfather, was actually sold as a kid in China. So he was sold to another family, and him and his brothers were sold to different families. And he actually has actually have a photo. This is like my grandfather and his adopted father, the father who bought him, essentially. And on the back of this laminated photo was like a little note. And it was written, I think, by my uncle who was getting that info from my grandfather. But it says, bro, nephew, younger bro, mother's grave. And he found his biological brothers and they met up. And this is them standing over their biological mother's grave.
Over her grave.
Yeah. Really like heavy stuff.
I was going to say powerful.
Very powerful. Like I found like really interesting photos. And this is actually something that I've taken into my RPG work. My grandfather, when he came to Canada, had a whole bunch of different jobs. One of them was he owned a lot of Toronto's early Chinese restaurants. So I have this photo here in front of one of his restaurants called Danny's. And I have photos of like really grainy black and white photos of like my mom and her brother working at the restaurant and seeing like, oh, they have a Chinese food menu and a white people menu. For like, they have like Chinese food, but also like chicken salad and stuff like that. Really
well, that's
funny.
what I'm eating right now.
Yeah, I love chicken salad.
I had
I'm not
chicken
gonna lie.
salad before the podcast, and then afterward, I'm getting ready to have my next chicken salad.
Amazing. And it's interesting because I took those stories of my grandfather and my mother working in these like restaurants and I incorporated them into a tabletop RPG product that I worked on.
Yes.
A game called Yancik, Blood in the Banquet Hall, which is about Chinese families. And I wrote the history of Toronto and Vancouver's Chinatowns in that product. And a lot of that was influenced by familial experiences and research. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about on the next episode of the podcast. And that's something we haven't done before. We've never talked about like ourselves and put ourselves in a place where, hey, let's be vulnerable and let's talk about how we take bits of ourselves and not only are like, we don't use our tables for therapy, but we maybe use our design projects or our businesses as a way of expressing the stories that we learned growing up.
It's interesting that you say that because I was going to ask kind of a final question, at least about the podcasting.
Sure, yeah.
To bookend it. But I was going to say, what do you feel like you get out of the process of, say, podcasting, streaming, creating in general? It's kind of interesting to me because it sounds like in a weird way, it's gone full circle because now in this next episode on Friday, you're mixing the personal.
It's personal.
With the right. This time, Asians respect.
Yeah, this time it's personal.
This time it's personal. It sounds like you're mixing the personal with the professional side.
It's very much like, hey, this is my process, and my process is very personal. For me, like the answer is like, what do I get from it? I don't do it for money. Obviously, I have a day job. Not the
fame and fortune.
Not the fame and fortune. It's cool to like when like, oh, this company sent me this thing. That's
swag.
Neat. Swag is cool. Never say no to swag. Yeah. But like for me, it's ultimately having someone feel seen in a conversation in the industry, or having people talk about issues that we face in the industry and trying to work towards solutions and kind of being a catalyst for that, I think is really, really great. Like I talked about Drew, the player in my home game, who's also like our community manager for Asians Represent. I met him because of the show. He literally messaged me just at the start of mid 2020. And he was like, hey, just started listening to Asians Represent. Just wanted to like, sure, he wouldn't mind me reading this. Let me find it.
Why not? If only you had told me beforehand, I could have like a little scroll here on the screen.
I know, right? This will be easy to find. But yeah, so he messaged me, and I won't put like a lot of detail in it. But he basically said, "Hey, it's Drew. I'm a half Chinese American or TTRPG player, and I've only ever really been like the only person of color in my groups based on where he lives and stuff." And he basically wrote to me with like a question about like, how do you kind of like bring your culture into a group that isn't that culture? And they said, "Love your work." And then we started talking, and then we just became really close friends. We started playing games together. You join Asians Represent. But for me, it's very much like helping people see that they're not alone in this hobby. I
Yeah.
don't say even industry, this
Yeah.
hobby.
Yeah.
And that alone makes it worthwhile. The fact that I made a very close friend out of this,
Mm.
honestly, if I shut down Asians Represent tomorrow, I'd be happy with where we were because of the impact that I've been able to have on the industry, the hobby, and the friends that I've been able to make, producing this content and just being vulnerable on the internet.
This reminds me of something you said in one of, I don't remember what channel, or I don't remember what particular episode or what particular the circumstances were, but I thought it was you that someone asked, what is it that you enjoy about the games? And maybe I'm wrong. I thought you had said that you enjoyed being able to introduce the culture,
Yeah,
and
100%.
you had
Yeah, that was
mentioned
me.
theme, and I think you said theme and setting. And so can you tell me a little bit about how theme and setting and culture kind of mix together, and how you introduce that to
Yeah, I think it
share?
really ties back to what I was saying about, historical accuracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, certain things are going to, like, obviously for theme is basically the foundation of, at least in my opinion, it's the foundation of the game you're going to play, the story you're going to tell, right? Theme is like, okay, we talked about this show, I want to talk about wuxia, I want to talk about xianxia, these narrative genres from China. I want to have a grim dark story, even to put it more simply. I want to have a grim dark story, a high fantasy story, a low fantasy story. Um, then in terms of like my culture, like what do I want to be the indicators of my culture in this story? Is it in the name of my character if I'm the player? Is it the clothing that is it that and the clothing that my character wears? Is it the world and everything around it? Is it like the kind of money that people use, the language that they speak? Is it, the weapons that we wield? Right. And then what was the third one? You said it was the theme,
Theme,
the
setting,
culture,
and
and then setting. So
culture.
setting
Yeah.
is, and they're all kind of interwoven, right? They all
Mm.
kind of play
Yeah.
off of each other, right?
Yeah.
If the theme is like wuxia, the setting will obviously have to be, well, in my mind, I'd want it to be Chinese, but there are going to be elements of it
Mm.
that will be different. There won't be magic. If I want it to be xianxia, there will be magic. It will be like high fantasy set in China. The theme might be different because it would involve like the divine and things like that. Whereas in a wuxia story, the theme would be about rebellion and an anti-establishment sort of story. Um, and then the setting would obviously be influenced by not only like culturally, I want it to be Chinese, but also like that's where I bring in my historical sort of angle to it too,
What
and also how much I bend it, I guess too.
Right. I wonder, was it kind of a, so you say these things, and actually in a weird kind of way, I try to think about like how I feel when I run games for my own players. And I think to myself, only in the simplest terms, I'll think about like, oh, it's really nice to be able to introduce my setting, right? And so of course the setting is fictional that I'm making up. But there are a couple settings that I've been, like every once in a while, I will draw on my natural interests. So I lived in France for a bit. I lived in Japan for quite a long time.
Where'd you live in Japan?
I was in Tokyo proper,
Oh,
so
okay, cool.
I was there for like 7 years, and I pretty much just studied.
Yeah.
That's all. I studied and I ran. I did a lot of jogging on the river by the Morinaga factory. So I would go out running, smelling chocolate, and then I would come home and I'm like, you know what? I deserve like a chocolate bar after running an hour. And then I'd go to like a Starbucks, or I go to a Royal Host, which is actually a
Right.
Canadian. It's a Canadian restaurant, right?
Oh,
Isn't
okay.
it? They have them in
I
Japan.
never heard of it.
Oh, okay. Then they've lied to me. But I thought,
I let me look this up. Let me look this
I
up.
swear, I thought that Royal Host was uh a Canadian. Like I went for many years, and I think at a certain point I discovered, oh, it's actually a Canadian thing.
Royal Hosts in Shinjuku is what I'm finding here. Royal
There's a
Host
million of them.
restaurant
There,
in
if
Japan.
they are
Yeah.
at every train station, and I used to go there
I
because Royal Host has ladies and gentlemen, I'm not a paid shill for Royal Host, but they have a free. They have this wonderful drink bar, and there are several occasions where I actually drank the Diet Coke out of the machine, but they were
I've
very good.
never heard of this. Never heard of this.
So it's not really Canadian then.
I don't think so. I've never seen
I
this.
feel very disappointed. I thought I knew something, but I guess I don't. But at any rate,
No, if I search Royal Host Canada, the first one I get is actually a TripAdvisor thing for Shinjuku.
okay. Well, I had, you know what? I had a buddy who is from Julian, you lied to me, sir. You lied
I mean,
to
it
me.
could be a Royal Host. I don't know, but I've never heard about it. I don't want to devalue Julian. But no, I've never heard of it.
He was my roommate over there for a few years. He was
Oh, okay.
he told me he was from Canada or is from Canada and assured me that Royal Host was a Canadian thing, but Julian,
I've never
we're
heard of
gonna
it. It
have
could be a different part of
talk.
Canada. Canada's a big country, right?
That's true, right? It could be like an East Coast, West Coast thing or North South thing or who knows.
That's mostly North South thing would be interesting. There's not much in between
That's
Canada, North
right.
and South.
Right.
We're primarily along the border.
And I also realized I just said East Coast, West Coast because your West Coast is actually Alaska, where
All West Coast of British Columbia. That's what we.
Oh, okay. All right, that's
Yeah.
fair. All right, it's
Yeah.
okay. I'm thinking
And then our East
like,
Coast is like the Maritimes, like Alaska.
All
I mean,
right.
Alaska's America.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a Toronto guy. Never heard of Royal Host. Maybe I've just been living under a rock.
No, or maybe you've been living life right. Maybe I've been wrong. You don't want to spend 3 hours a day studying Japanese at a Royal Host and drinking nothing but diet soda because trust me, like
I
you've got
mean,
caffeine
look,
chills
that's
for
an
the rest.
experience. You know, like I think that's still an experience. It's a cultural experience. Maybe it's an establishment in Japan, and so it's like saying I didn't have a proper Japanese experience because I ate at 7-Eleven all the time.
Right.
That would be extremely incorrect to say
Well,
because the 7-Elevens in Japan are just completely different than here.
Make no mistake, I did get a very I thought I got a very good experience in my 7 years. And I guess what I was getting at with my question before I got so obsessed with Royal Host, because it is delicious. I haven't eaten there in years. But I guess what I was getting at was I remember I ran a few games that were set because I'm kind of into like the 15 and 1600s of both France and like of Japan. I'm kind of interested in these eras, and I don't know why. They just happen to stick with me for some reason. And I remember
It doesn't matter.
Well, yeah. Well, so I remember running some games set in France and some games set in Japan around the eras that I was interested in and had read about and all of that.
They're so wildly different.
Well, yes, they are wildly different, but I felt this sort of relief. Like I had described to my friends what it was like to be like, you know, in Paris or whatever. And I described to my friends what it was like to be in Tokyo. But I found that suddenly when I was running a game in those settings, I felt a little bit more freed, like I was really giving them a more interesting experience, not necessarily a more accurate one, though I was trying. And I was wondering, do you feel like you're expressing yourself, perhaps if you're running a game and you're sort of influenced or even making it historically anchored, do you feel like you're sharing a part of like...
Oh, that's what we do, whatever we do, anything creative, right? Yes, we're playing a game, but the improvisational part of it and the inherently made up part of it makes it so that you bring a part of yourself, whether you're running the game or you're making a character, because like I had said earlier, it's a collaborative story. Everybody's going to bring a part of them. And if people are coming from different cultures, there's going to be some give and take. There are going to be times when you're going to have to take liberties. And that's okay. And that's what kind of takes the pressure off of it. Because one end is like, yeah, I want to make sure it's accurate as possible and respectful, but but I also want to make sure that it's fun for everybody at the table.
Right.
So yeah, if Mark wants to play a character who's a local in my land, but he's also playing a dwarf, so be it. You kind of have to pick and choose what you want to be accurate. In the same sense, when you're trying to add your own spin to it, you also want to do it in a sense that, like, how can I make this respectful?
Yeah.
How can I build upon something in a way that's respectful, even though I can't add to the accuracy? And I think ultimately, as long as everyone is being respectful at the table, it doesn't matter how accurate you are.
Right. How do you feel, or what was it like when you sort of first sat down? So now it's one thing to be creating games in private and writing up material for your own setting and all that. What do you have a first experience with, say, writing something down and saying, you know what, I'm going to distribute this, or I'm going to try and sell it to someone, or I'm going to
Oh my God.
Oh, is it that far? Is that long ago?
Do you know what? No, actually.
Oh.
I started working in like the tabletop gaming industry, like by chance. I didn't even, like I said earlier, I didn't even think that it was a possibility, because when it all started on Reddit of all things. I was essentially, when I was teaching at the museum and doing D&D and stuff, I was going to like conventions as a fan, like going to anime conventions, going to like comic book conventions. My dad is a big comic book collector. My mom would always go with me to all the anime conventions when I was a kid, and my mom would bring peanut butter sandwiches and go around the artist alley and just give people sandwiches and stuff.
That's
it was
great.
Cute. She still doesn't know about the stuff that I like, but she went and indulged.
Yeah.
And I still go to cons, but I was like, hey, Daniel, check to see if they've got this. So I still do that for my dad. But I never thought that working in the industry, even as a freelancer or full-time, could even be a thing. It's just like, oh, these are products that I consume. It's until one day, my close friend and boss at the museum was like, Daniel, somebody's talking about you on Reddit. It's like, oh, okay. Well, what are they saying? And they found out. They were like, oh, somebody runs a D&D program at the museum here. How cool is that?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's neat. Let me reach out to them.
Yeah.
And they ended up being like an artist who works in tabletop games. Their handle on Twitter is Portable City. And they ended up being like one of my like first contacts in the industry. They work in like RPGs and comics. And I invited them over to my class, and I said, hey, do you want to like I've got some budget. Can I like pay you to work with my students and do a live painting of one of the characters in our campaign?
That's cool.
I talk about, how an artist kind of looks at historical sources and poses and stuff like that. And it was like a really cool experience. So I kind of kept in touch with them, and I ended up being a guest at a convention couple months after, because they had mentioned, hey, there's this guy and he does this stuff. And so it all started with me being an educator using RPGs. Then people found out I had an academic background and all of this stuff. I think I got my first, I don't even remember. Oh, I started podcasting before I started working as a writer and stuff. And I got my first gig as a cultural consultant on a small indie game. I don't even know if it ever came out. But I got paid $90 just to take a look at a game. It's like a couple pages. And I was like, I remember being in New York on vacation with my girlfriend and being like, somebody paid me just to read it and tell them what's wrong.
Right.
I was like, this is a thing? And then I got, and then I ended up getting a approach to work on a 7th Sea product.
Oh, wow.
And
that's cool.
The project ended up falling through, I guess, for financial reasons or whatnot. And I didn't end up getting to work on it. But I got so excited at the prospect of it. I wrote up all the stuff.
You had a taste.
I had a taste of it. And I ended up using that stuff for our Dungeons and Agents actual play. But after that, I just kind of, people just started approaching me and being like, hey, do you want to write? One of the earliest sort of narrative writing gigs I got was for the King in Yellow RPG. or like a monster for it. It was like a really small freelance assignment. I ended up consulting on a Korean project. That was a whole other thing I talked about on my podcast because I'm not Korean. And then I just started working on a lot of stuff. And then all of a sudden I got an email from um, say what you want. I got an email from Mike Merles at
Yes,
Wizards of the Coast.
this is something I wanted to hear about. That
Yeah,
was
how did I get that? Um, Basically, Mike Merles emailed the One Shot Network asking for my contact information, which is still really weird to me. Um, I ended up, they wanted a writing sample. I ended up writing like a Chinese culture. I wish I had saved it because I thought it was really cool what I wrote. But then they were like, hey, we want you to work on this project. It's an adventure. It's this level. It just has to start at this library and you can do whatever you want. It then became Candlekeep Mysteries.
yeah.
But up until that point, I had worked for a lot of other freelance projects just because of connections that I had made through the podcast. And then after Candlekeep came out, I just ended up getting bigger and bigger opportunities. I've turned down a lot just because, like my well-being is very important to me and all that. And I have some really cool stuff that I wish I could talk about on the horizon, but I can't. But yeah, I just kind of made one connection and it kind of spiraled into something else. And I've always made sure that I'm like, hey, I am going to be my truest self when I work in this industry. The Daniel you see on like this podcast, the Daniel you see on Twitter, on my podcast is very much who I am. Like there are parts of me that are private that people will never see, but the part of me that is out there is always going to be, and I've tried very intentionally to do this, my most authentic self. And I found that has helped me get opportunities.
How much of yourself is in the stuff that you write and create then? Like, do you have a particular, if I might ask, do you have a particular, is there a particular project? It doesn't have to be big.
Oh, I wish
small.
I could say there's a huge
there something that's
project.
very, very like, it's like you on the page.
Oh yeah. I mean, first of all, Ross Rifles, there is an illustration of me in Ross Rifles.
What page is it
on? My copy of Ross Rifles is over there. It's a big spread and it's two soldiers. It's done in like, it's supposed to look like it's done in like ballpoint pen. Because we were like, how can we make it look as DIY as possible? And it's of two soldiers taking a break in a trench.
I think I know. I'm afraid to pull it up because I feel like it's gonna throw itself over the. Well,
don't worry about the overlay. But it's of two soldiers looking at each other in a trench, having a conversation, and that's actually me and Patrick.
Oh.
Yeah. For the most part, there were only a handful of like original illustrations in there. Those illustrations are actually going to a museum right now, which is really cool.
Really, that is now.
Yeah. Well, I can talk about that in the future. Can't talk about it now. Okay. But awesome. That illustration is of me. But in terms of like the truest manifestation of myself, that's actually in two projects that are coming out, and I can't talk about them yet because of an NDA. I finished working on them over a year ago, but they're not out yet. But one of them is so deeply, deeply, deeply personal.
Is it hard? Was it difficult or was it easy to write?
No, it was the easiest thing because I can't say much, but based on the theme and all that stuff, I was like, I have to put my family in here. This is the way that I kind of pass on our stories and honor our family. I don't say that in like honor, but like this is how I pass on our stories. And this is like the opportunity to take these experiences and codify them in the way that other people can understand them. And it's two projects that are coming out. One I worked on in January of this year, and another I worked on I had been working on since the start of 2021 all the way to like June of this year. I guess less than a year I've removed, but not in my mind right now. But yeah, they were both very deeply personal. So
you have these literally maybe big projects with maybe big publishers.
They're one of them is like it's a production, and another is like a game. I mean, aside from Candlekeep and the stuff I've done with Paizo, probably the biggest projects I've worked on.
What about the tiny stuff? So you have some micro RPGs out there and some smaller stuff.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
what,
The most personal one of my micro RPGs is Wicked Congregation.
tell me about, what do you enjoy then about the micro RPG format?
Um, they're easy to write.
There we go. All
I
right.
wrote one. It's
That's
not
it.
for sale anymore, but I wrote one. Can I curse on your program?
You can do anything you want if you set your mind to it.
Okay, cool. So I wrote a game called You're Fucking Awesome.
Uh-huh.
And it's a business card RPG because
Oh.
I was at a con
Why does
called
this
Big Bad
sound
Con.
familiar? I feel like I've probably heard of it.
I'd be surprised if you did.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
It's essentially I was at Big Bad Con and I got introduced to like really small scale RPGs.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote one there with some friends called Misfortune Quest, and it's about eating fortune cookies and using the fortunes to take a story.
Oh, wow. That is awesome.
But I was inspired by I remember seeing these people who had made at Big Bad Con. I had seen a lot of micro RPGs, and at the first PAX Unplugged, I saw somebody who made a business card RPG about birds, like
Cool.
seeing birds and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I never thought about this as a format. And so after Big Bad Con, I wrote a business card RPG, and I called it You're Fucking Awesome. And I published it on these like really thick business cards, and it was literally like a way to gamify positive affirmations to oneself.
Is it a solo game or is it?
It's just a solo game. It's like a thing you're meant to keep in your wallet and just tell yourself, hey, you're fucking awesome. That's the entire purpose of it. And that's the microest of RPGs. I've like written ones where it was like about telling a story when you're eating string cheese. But I think the most personal and my favorite solo game that I've written is Wicked Congregation. It's a hack of another game called The Wretched. It's a solo game where you're supposed to die at the end. And it's meant to use a deck of playing cards, some 6-sided dice, and a Jenga tower.
So tell me about that. Yeah, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so The Wretched is the game that it's based on. I used the system from it. And The Wretched is basically inspired by Alien, like the xenomorph, like... Wicked Congregation is kind of like the sort of amalgamation of like some of my favorite interests. Like I am a big fan of like the Resident Evil franchise. I really love sort of weird fiction. I love the Mignola-verse, like Hellboy and the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Defense. I love the video game Control. It's one of my favorite video games of all time.
Can I give you an interesting aside that you might find to be cool?
Sure, yeah.
I met Mike Mignola.
I've met him too.
At New York Comic Con back in 1996, and I bought an original piece from Alien Salvation. I bought the very last page for like $50.
I met him at a Fan Expo Canada, I think when I was like 16 years old.
Oh, cool.
And I have a sketch that he did of
a Hellboy.
Young Hellboy.
Yes.
Saying, I have a sketch of him he drew this for me on the spot.
Yeah.
And it's of young Hellboy saying pancakes.
That's awesome.
That's at my parents' house. I should find it. But yeah, I love those sorts of media properties, particularly Hellboy. I'm a really big fan of Hellboy. I worked on this. I was really, my co-host from the podcast, Agatha, turned me on to like solo RPGs, not just micro, but solo RPGs. And I was really fascinated by them. And I thought The Wretched was so cool. I played it and I was like, oh, this is really neat. So I wanted to make my own. And this was kind of at a time when anti-Asian sort of hate crimes were happening a lot in the United States. And I was very affected by it because I used to go to the States a lot for like academic conferences back in grad school, but also for gaming conventions. And I was like, very like, I don't want to go to the States anymore. And, seeing what's happening in the US now, I'm just like, well, we got our issues in Canada, but like there is some like heavy shit happening in the US. Like basic human rights are being taken away from people in a country where we're the most advanced country in the world. And like socially, it's becoming like very much so not.
Yeah.
So Wicked Congregation was kind of like my way of sort of channeling the nervousness and the anxiety that I felt about being a person of color in a small town. And so the game is about you being a member of a task force for this fictional agency called the BPS, the Bureau of Paranatural Survey.
Mm-hmm.
And much like the SCP, you're meant to go in and contain these like artifacts that are dangerous to humanity and make sure that people don't know about it.
Mm.
And essentially the game starts with your team going into a small mountain town in sort of like Appalachia. And it's meant to be ambiguous. It's not actually, it doesn't say Appalachia, but it's a small mountain town, a remote, small white town in the States.
Mm.
And there was a cult there. And the cult has basically, the leader of the cult has basically unearthed this artifact, and it's allowing them to manipulate the population in sort of the same sense that you have like this demagogue, like, in the United States. And so when your strike team arrives and your task force arrives, everyone is wiped out but you, and you manage to escape with this artifact. And the game is about the artifact talking to you.
Mm.
And it makes you ask questions. So the entire thing is that you draw cards, but also pull Jenga tower and stuff like that. And it asks you questions, and it gets you to reflect on how you're going to die as your character is narratively being hunted by this cult who's trying to get it back. And you are then having a conversation with this otherworldly entity through an object as in your last hours. And that's the game. And so it was like, yeah, I think it's cool because like Wicked Congregation, that's such a cool name. And I think visually, I love the design. Will Parks, who did the graphic design, also was our graphic designer for Ross Rifles. He's a friend of mine. And I thought like visually looked good. I thought my writing was on point for it. And I also felt like it was just a personal project. It felt like this is how I can channel how I feel. I'm never one to say like, oh, I put my feeling into my art, but this was like the only time when I was like, this was my outlet in that moment.
Was that difficult to write? Was that difficult to like face those
I had
kinds of things, or
no. I mean, like I've got a good support system, and I talk to my friends a lot about this sort of stuff. And maybe it's also me being desensitized by the media that I consume. Because I love horror and stuff like that. But no, it wasn't hard to write. It was actually a really fun experience writing. I was replaying the I wasn't replaying. I was playing the 7th Resident Evil game for the first time while I was writing that, and watching a lot of weird sort of fiction. There was this a really cool short film that was really inspiring to me at the beginning called Overlord.
Yeah.
SCP Overlord was really, really influential for me, because it was like, yeah, that's the thing. You're at SCP task force and you go in and everyone's killed but you get away with this object, and now it's speaking to you and it's corrupting you. So yeah, that I had a lot of fun doing it. I stayed at lots of late nights staying up and just writing just because I was really into it.
Right.
And like, I'm lucky I work from home, so I could just like go to sleep and get up and be like, okay, time to work.
Was this another solo game?
Yeah, this one is a solo game.
So let me ask you this. I'm really interested in the fact that
oh, and you had asked earlier when I started publishing my own solo stuff. And it was actually during the pandemic that I started publishing my own solo stuff.
Okay. I was going to say these are things like playing the game seems like a solo game is rather intimate, and of course these questions and some of the things that you like, taking out the business card game, it's very personal to go in there and sort of you're trying to boost yourself, and then with the other game you're actually trying to like walk through like the ways.
It's introspective.
It's introspective.
Yeah.
A tabletop can also be when you're running a game for multiple people and ad-libbing and people are just throwing out narrative ideas and things like that. You can, you can bring in safety tools. You can talk about it beforehand, but sometimes things happen. You can touch on sensitive ideas or maybe a topic.
Of course, yeah.
How do you maybe as a game master try to handle those those situations, like if you've been
Yeah.
in them or.
Oh, certainly. Like I've been a player in awkward situations. I've been a GM in awkward situations. Look, people are like going to make mistakes. People are going to show their biases. And I think there are certainly scenarios where it's just like, okay, you're 100% wrong. Get out of here. But there are also going to be people who make innocent mistakes
Yeah.
all the time. And people mispronounce things.
Yeah.
People make assumptions that are based on stereotypes and they don't without even realizing it. For me, I always err on like, hey, let's be educational about this. This is a learning opportunity, right? Now, if it becomes a pattern, that's a completely different thing.
Right.
But for me, it's like, the TTRPG safety toolkit is out there. That is a free resource for people to use. For me, it's like as long as I maintain an open communication with like my group, we can basically handle any obstacle that kind of comes our way. It's like, hey, I want to set the precedent that like we are going to engage with the things that make us uncomfortable. I don't like the way you said this thing. Here's why. Let's talk about it. Does this mean like I'm mad at you? No, I just wanted to tell you because I trust you. And I trust that you can fix this. And I would expect that you would say the same thing to me if I did the same thing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about like mutual respect. Again, like safety at the table shouldn't be complicated, right? It should just be rooted in respecting everyone else's experiences and what they bring to the table and understanding that our words have power, right? And that we need to understand that our words have power at the table and can affect others in both positive and negative ways. And so if we go into a game, whether we're running it or being a player, with the understanding that, hey, what I say has real meaning and what others say will have meaning to me, and that I should keep myself open to learning opportunities and also open to hearing and giving space for to others at the table, I shouldn't run into any issues. I think there's also, we live in an age where people are afraid to not know the answer to something.
Yeah.
And you'll see it on the podcast all the time. I don't edit these out when like I make a mistake or I maybe use the wrong pronouns for somebody, or there was a recent episode where I said something that was ableist without really realizing it. And my one of the guests, like a recurring guest, sort of like called me out on it live, and I said, thank you. Let's talk about it. And I think being able to be vulnerable and not being open to learning and being able to make a mistake and correct that mistake is a really important skill to have. But that said, it's, you can be receptive of feedback, but you also need to be able to give feedback in a constructive way. So at the table, it's all about, again, it's all rooted in mutual respect, right? Being there to understanding that you're going to learn from others, being there to understand that you are also going to teach others. I can't say much more, right? It seems straightforward, but yet we still deal with these things.
Well, I was very impressed by a story you told. Again, I'm so sorry. They all sort of blur together at a certain point, especially when you're researching over weeks. But you mentioned it might have even been the same. Anyway, you had mentioned that you were at a convention, and I think somebody in the audience said something that was either offensive.
Oh, is this this?
Oh,
yes.
You stepped down. I guess after the panel.
I talked to them after the
for
panel.
Like 20 or 30 minutes now.
Yeah. That was at Breakout Con.
Okay, so that was extremely impressive to me for a couple of reasons. Of course, the first reason is that you were willing to do that. Okay, that's the first reason. The second reason is that also they were willing to talk to you afterward as well. They didn't just walk away, right? But the third maybe reason is it takes a lot of energy to do that. And we can't do that for as much as we want to. We can't do that for every single human being in the world, right? I think it would be wonderful.
That's why we make
could.
the podcast.
Right. So I guess this might be a very silly question, but
no such thing.
In this world of Twitter and quick like TikTok and all of that, where people are very quick to throw angry things out, rather like problematic things, or rather outright racist, or rather sexist, or rather whateverist.
Tell me
Things out
about it.
there.
Yeah.
If in this world where people are, it's so easy to do that, and where it's so hard to step off the stage after the show and talk for 20 minutes to one person.
Mm.
Are we kind of doomed for the foreseeable future? Or do you think we're going to pull out of this? Do you think this is a fad where we don't understand how to use tech yet? A lot of the nasty
question.
stuff are crawling out of the woodwork, and they're going to go away. Or what do you think? It's kind of a big question.
It's a big question. I mean, that's in and of itself a very complex conversation. I mean, we're seeing that on Twitter right now, right? We're seeing we want to exist in these sort of like centralized communities, but we want to not have moderation or have moderation.
Yeah.
People are always going to, in my mind, like there are always going to be assholes out there. There are always going to be people out there who are inherently like hateful and awful people. And I think that's an unfortunate, part of humanity, right? There are always going to be hateful people. And I think one thing that I very much am trying to push for in my own little way is, you see it in our content too, is platforms like Twitter or like TikTok or anything like that. People get engagement and attention from anger, and people get engagement and attention from calling out people and not being constructive, because people want to be angry at something. And that's something that, we honestly grew from at the beginning. Like we kind of blew up when we decided that we would get angry at Oriental Adventures Live. And you'll notice that our content has changed very dramatically in the past 3 years, right? We're no longer doing these live reads to just hate on something. We're trying to be more constructive. We're trying to lead by example. And it's something that I want to be hopeful, and I think will change in the near future. But I think it ultimately comes down to people making like small local change, right? Like, this is why at the beginning before we were live, you were like, you know what? Like, I'm happy you said yes to me because I don't have that many followers. I'm like, I don't care, because honestly, this has been a wonderful conversation. And if one person watches this conversation and says, you know what, I want to go back to my table and I want to say, hey, this is how I want to run things a little bit differently. I want to run things a little more egalitarian, or I want to make sure that we're all respecting each other, or, hey, I didn't like the way that you did that. Can we talk about it? Like, I think that would make this 2-hour conversation worthwhile. If one person could just make their home game a little bit more positive for even their friends, right? So ultimately, I think, do I see a big long-term change? I hope for it. But for me, my goal has always been small-term change, like small-scale change, I should say, because that is where I can have impact. It's very much a similar analogy to brands who want to go after micro-influencers over influencers, because micro-influencers can drive people's actions at a higher rate than influencers, because their audience, their small audience, if you look at it from a marketing perspective, is far more engaged. Your group of friends are more likely to listen to you. And I think that's where I want to be.
Let me ask you then, you've been really generous with your time, and
yeah, no worries.
I appreciate it. And we're sort of approaching the witching hour, but maybe as a final question here, is there something that you want people to know about you, about yourself?
About me?
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest, right? We're not streaming or podcasting because we don't want people to sort of hear what we have to say, or
to hear what we have to say, or see us.
Is there something, maybe either you've said it already, or you've done it already or whatever, but is there something you want people to know about Daniel Kwan?
Ooh, I've never been asked that question before. I don't even know if that was all the list of questions you sent me.
It was the last question, sir.
It was the last question. That's why I guess I remember it.
So
I gotta say, like, I think if there was one, this is a very good question. I think if there was one thing I want people to learn about me, I don't think it's about me because ultimately don't think I matter. Not in like a sort of a nihilistic sense. Like, I don't think I should matter to people. I think what should matter to people is the work that I do. I don't think people need to know about me, but what I would love is for people to get one positive thing out of the work I've done, whether it be like this podcast right here that we're doing, or an episode of Asians Represent, or you looked at Candlekeep Mysteries and you thought, I didn't know that Chinese people could write for D&D. I want to do this. Or if it was like, see this like in our Discord server, it's like, hey, I finally have a place where I can be my truest self and talk about my like the Asian issues I face in a room in a community full of people who understand. That's what I want people to not know about me, but I want people to feel my impact and feel my intentions there. So it's less about Daniel, the person, and more about my work that I want people to know, because I want people to benefit from my work. I don't need your dollars. I just want people to understand what I'm kind of putting out there in the world. I want people to benefit from it. It's not for me to benefit. It's for everyone else out there. And that's ultimately what Asians Represent is.
Well, I can say for those of you watching at home, everybody knows I bring on people that I'm interested in talking to and I think have interesting things to say. And believe me when I say we've only like just seen the tip of the iceberg as far as like Daniel's stuff goes. The people he works with, the people he runs or plays with. And I really
all way cooler people than me.
No, he's being very modest.
All way cooler people.
Modest.
Let's be honest.
They're all
my whole thing is surround myself with people who are smarter and better than me, so I can be inspired to improve.
They're a great group, and Daniel is a great host and MC and all of those other things that you might call the person that's like sort of like the hub on the wheel of Asians Represent, the channel and the games. So I have put links to the things that he does, which is not content. He creates like works of like art, of interest, of essays, video essays, and discussions and things like that. Whatever this stuff is going to be called in the future, it shouldn't be called content. It's like real like work.
But like codified experiences or something out there.
So I recommend that you immediately go to the links below and honestly check it out. I don't push things on people that I don't believe in, and I think you can tell that he's got a lot of really interesting things to say, which we've only skimmed the surface of with my list, with the questions I could ask out of my list tonight. So,
well, that's very, very kind of you. I mean that. Look, I appreciate you reaching out, and I haven't done a podcast in a really long time.
No, this is I love it.
So you know what? Happy to chat. This is a good interview. I'm glad we were able to find a time and do this. I think this has gotten me certainly thinking about my own work.
I'm glad.
And making sure and doing sort of that inventory in my head of like, am I is all of my work aligned with my values? And I think that's something, honestly, everyone should say. And if your values are awful and you're all about negativity, then like,
don't align
yourself,
them
right?
to your own values. Then you can,
then don't.
Just
align.
Keep
them.
to
yourself.
Right.
Keep to yourself and stay in the darkness. And know that there's positivity out there if you want to learn from it. Because I think everybody deserves a chance.
I love it. I totally do. And not just, he's wise, not just in RPGs and design, but also in life, ladies and gentlemen.
I feel like I've lived a very full life right now, and all I want is a simple life.
Yeah. I
think honestly, that's what most people should strive for is simplicity. That's kind of me. It's like, I not like, don't have expensive tastes. I don't like fancy things. I was just excited yesterday because I went to the Lego store.
That's great. The Lego store is awesome.
I love the Lego store.
I grew up near a Lego factory, actually, but
That is super cool. That'd be really
It
neat
was
to.
pretty neat. I mean, it
That'd be
was.
super cool.
I never got to go, but they did have like little tours and things like that. I always thought I should like go back and check it out, but
Oh, that's
someday I
awesome.
think.
Yeah, I bought um treated myself to something nice.
Nice.
My girlfriend and I are big fans of The Office, like the
Oh,
sitcom,
yeah.
and they made like a limited edition Lego set of The Office. And so
That's
I
that's
was like, you know
ridiculously
what? I'm
awesome.
never going to be able to buy this again. I don't really treat myself a lot. In fact, I think that's a character flaw. I
Mm.
don't take care of myself as well as I think I should.
Hmm.
And so I was like, get this thing.
Well,
That's as fancy as I get.
I
As
think it's
fancy as I get.
wonderful. It's the little things, and like we were saying, it kind of comes back to childhood pleasures that are really should be adult pleasures as well, or unforgotten
A hundred
pleasures.
percent agree. 100% agree. And I think, surround yourself with like-minded people and who challenge you and
Mm.
make sure that you're your best version of yourself. And I think that honestly happens at the table for tabletop role-playing games.
Well, what else could we say to leave you all there to yourselves tonight, ladies and gentlemen? Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the conversation, please do check out Daniel's stuff. It's, as I said, it's linked in below. And also think about maybe liking, subscribing, and maybe even sharing to kind of give me a little bit of a boost if you enjoyed this. As Daniel was kind of saying, we're not really, and I'm not doing this for the fame and fortune, but it is nice to bring messages and new
I
people
think
and
fame
new
seems
voices.
overrated.
Yes. I don't want to be
I think
famous. If I
fame
wanted to
seems
be famous,
overrated.
I wouldn't be running on YouTube.
Yeah, I think what's more important is impact.
Yes,
And sometimes, you can have that with fame, but it can be done at a smaller scale too.
I agree. So
Yeah.
thank you, Daniel, so much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Matt.
Thank you to everyone out there that's been watching, and everybody out there have a great game and stay safe. I'll see you on the next episode of Role Player with 1,000 Faces.